most of you are familiar with cookies, especially when you see things like this on a variety of different websites. We're pretty used to having to accept cookies or reject them, and maybe they're going to keep tracking us anyway. But what you may not know is some of the history of how the cookie came into existence and kind of the arc of its trajectory as we went along. So let's go back to 1994. I think I was 6 years old at this time, so I don't remember the web as it existed then, but I did some research, and it might have looked something like this. So this was a Mosaic browser, which is kind of the precursor to like Netscape. Might look something like that, or a web search forum, something like this. Yahoo, really early days. So cookies didn't exist when this version of the web. So how would you store state in a world without cookies? Does anybody know? Shout out an answer. Go ahead. URL. I heard URL, IP. So URL, that's a great way. So I found a site that actually is still operational. It's called the Barney Fun Page. I don't know that I agree with the premise of this, but at the very least, it was a very interesting exploration in how to store state. So as you navigate this page, you click on these weapons, let's call them drawing implements, and you can draw things, and each time you change and do something on the page, it takes you to a new URL. And you can end up drawing something. So I drew an R for remix. And so as you can see in the bottom here, it's actually changing the URL each time with these numbers. That's how it's storing the state. So each time you click the image, it's using this image map, which I didn't even know was a thing, but it's really pretty interesting, and it still works today. You can go check it out. So state didn't exist, and this team over here at Netscape, they had a client that had a problem. And the problem, of course, came from e-commerce, which seemed only fitting. And this guy, Lou Montulli, had an idea to help solve this problem. So the problem was the MCI, they didn't want to store all of this state on their server. And so how could they do this? A shopping cart, pretty common. And so Lou was like, yeah, you're probably not going to be able to do that. So like, what can we come up with to help? And the cookie was the thing that came to mind. And so they spent a little bit of time and developed the cookie. There was a competing way to track how users were there in the state, and that was kind of a universal client ID. And Lou really didn't like this concept of a client ID because it would be global and universal and make it really easy to track people. And so he really had this privacy mindset from the forefront to build the cookie in a way that could protect privacy. And so eventually, the original version of Netscape included the cookie and became very popular very quickly. And as Netscape dominated the market, so did cookies, and they became commonplace very quickly. So let's take a look at the cookie. This is actually the original patent for the cookie. And we can zoom in here a little bit, and you can see right away that it's exactly what you would expect. From the very original concept of the cookie, it is basically what we have today. And so a browser sends a post request about some product, let's say, that you're interested in adding to your cart. The server generates some wrapper about the cookie and returns it. The browser stores that cookie and then about the product. And then as you keep browsing, it'll store more cookies. And then if you're done, you go to a checkout page and it sends all those cookies along so the server can process the transaction. So how does it do that? So from the RFC, there's a couple things. So there's a set cookie header. So in Remix, that would look something like this. You return headers with set cookie and just a cookie name and a value. It's very simple. So the concept of the cookie was just a way to pass data that is very simple. So just a name and a value. And then when you're on the server and you want to see what cookies the browser has sent, you just get the cookie header and you can log it out, and it looks something like this with a list of cookie names and values. And there were some other rules in the RFC about how many the browser should store and how long should it keep them and all of this other stuff. But that's the essence of the cookie. It's very simple. Lou said it took about an hour of coding to implement, and eventually that was all you needed. But there are some other attributes on the cookie. So there is an expires header, looks something like this, weird date format, perhaps before they had some of the standardized formats. But this is the maximum lifetime of a cookie, and it's when the cookie expires. So this is when the browser will no longer send that cookie along with new requests. One thing to keep in mind is browsers do not have to honor this, and they may purge the cookie prior to the expiration. So you don't want to rely on it necessarily. The max age is very similar. So this is, you wouldn't really do both of these, but max age is another way to say when the cookie expires, so number of seconds. And again, they don't have to honor this. A domain, so this was kind of one that I wasn't familiar with, but you can specify a domain, so like example.com, and then the browser will only send cookies about that domain. And you can put subdomains and other things of that nature in here, but this one is maybe not super well known, but it could be a problem if you had a host like Vercel or something with lots of subdomains. This was a problem early on for cookies. If you had somebody that wanted to have a cookie and they tried to set on a vercel.com, even though their website was example.vercel.com, that could be a problem. Path, this is another way to segment cookies. So you could set the path only for certain segments of your website, can have different cookies. And the browser will respect that and only send those cookies along when you're at that certain URL. This is another one that I wasn't too familiar with. I think we always see path / and you just accept that you have the cookie stored for your entire site, and it just is always there. But there are some pretty cool use cases you could come up with to use this path. Then we have the secure attribute. You don't have to always include this, but it is good nowadays when you want to protect a cookie for like session information. You can say secure, and it will only be sent with HTTPS, and so the browser won't leak this credential if you're on an unsecure website. Then HTTP only. This is a way to make sure that the cookies aren't readable from JavaScript or any other browser ability. So the cookies will only be managed by the browser and sent over HTTP, and this is a way to protect against some of the attacks on cookies, like some rogue script reading them from your session or from your browser and then sending them elsewhere to a malicious site. So if you're using this for the session, you always want to have HTTP only set so that they aren't accessible via JavaScript. And then there was a kind of interesting way to remove a cookie, and that's just to call setCookie, so with an expiration in the past. So you can do that very simply with the expires at some date in the past. Or you can do max age or with 0 or something like that. But this would be the recommended way of expires. OK, so back to that early time. So we're in 1995 now, and as you can imagine, the web started moving very fast. We got Amazon.com, and it started something like this, which was very interesting. But you can imagine they already had shopping carts and this sort of thing. Login, you can see on here. And very early on, they're already taking a huge advantage of cookies. And then there was eBay. And then Netscape started upgrading, and lots of things are happening. And then this guy came along. And if you aren't familiar, DoubleClick was the company that started very early on to monetize and start tracking cookies, they used cookies in order to track users and provide advertising. As you can imagine, Lou was not super happy with this, and so he was actually tasked with trying to figure out what should we do about these cookies that are being kind of abused and not really how we intended. Should we disable cookies altogether? Should we prevent third-party cookies and leave other cookies? And he was really not sure what to do, and the kind of founders or management at Netscape basically left it up to him. At the end of the day, he decided that it was better to keep cookies, and there were a couple reasons. One was, at the time, advertising was a large part of all websites on the internet. And so if we removed advertising, then how would these websites get revenue? So there was a pretty big incentive to keep that status quo. And then secondly, he thought if we remove cookies, then DoubleClick or whoever is going to find some other way to track users, and it will be less transparent than the cookies we have today. With cookies, at the very least, users can go into the browser settings, clear them, they can see what's being stored, and they have control, at least to a certain degree. So it was kind of, let's accept what's there, and ultimately we kept cookies. Then the 2010s came, and we kind of fell out of love with cookies. Meteor, some of the single-page apps, Elm, all of these tools started to send just a single document to the client and use JavaScript to store a JWT or use local storage or something like that. And we started to see this perspective that cookies actually aren't that great. And at UDisc, we found that we were using Meteor, and I found a blog post from Meteor saying like this whole thing about how local storage is better than cookies and cookies are insecure. And I think maybe that was true to some degree at the time. There were some dangers and security issues with cookies, but you could largely get around them. In any case, it was very challenging for us to deal with authentication and all these other things without cookies, and Meteor just did not have a solution. And the same was true with all these single-page applications. You would load some web page, and then there'd be this flash of content as you see the user's avatar or whatever login information finally get loaded. And so I think this pain kind of led us into where we are today as we get the return of server-side rendering. And with server-side rendering, it became even more obvious as you'd get that flash of content changing when it's like, hey, we didn't know if you were logged in, but now we do. And so here you go, here's your avatar, and we'll render your user settings instead of a login link. And Remix comes into the picture here and makes this ever more apparent and also so easy to work with. And so I wanted to talk through some of the use cases with Remix and how we can use cookies to really make a great user experience. So probably the number one is going to be user session storage. If you've booted up the Indie app stack or the Blues stack or really written just about any website, you probably have to deal with user sessions. And Remix provides a great story for this. So looking at the Remix Indie stack, I just wanted to walk us through what happens when a user logs in, what's happening with the cookie. So let's look, you go to the login page, you log in, and the first thing that happens is a post request to the login route. And we have this set cookie here. So the set cookie is setting some session with a max age, path, HTTP only, same site lax. And then we can see here what the value of that session cookie looks like. So this is decoded, so it didn't look like this. It was this EY. It always starts with EY. I think that's the base 64 for the curly brace. So it looks like this. So it's just a user ID. So all we're storing is the user ID here in the cookie in an encoded way. Then when Remix redirects you after you're logged in successfully to the Get page of notes, and when you see on my computer, it was way too long to fit on this slide, but it's all of the cookies for localhost, which happens to be a ton when you're a developer. But in this case, I just showed you, you have your GA ID for Google Analytics, of course, and then there's the session for Remix. And you can see it was passed along to the server as well, along with all those other cookies. And then when Remix gets this request, it can know who you are. And so it returns the response that you're this user, with some extra details to render the page. Okay, so what this looks like when you're implementing it in Remix is very simple. You have a session storage, so create cookie session storage. And we specify all those different things that map to those properties. Something different that you'll see here is the secrets. So while not part of the cookie spec, the secrets are there to verify that the cookie is from from our server. So we can make sure that nobody is just making up a cookie that looks like something that we would use. Okay. And then when we log out, you can see the set cookie here with the expires in 1970, and we get logged out. Definitely the most common use case, and you'll see that all the time. You can add plenty of other attributes in addition to the user ID if you need to. One of the more interesting use cases that we came up with at UDisc was when we were especially when we were migrating from Meteor to Remix, is user preferences. So we store several different user preferences, like the theme for light or dark. We also store, like, are you looking at meters or feet, things like this. And so all of these preferences are set by the user, and we want them to apply immediately. One interesting thing that we ran into is because we were migrating, we needed a way to share that user preference with both apps. And so we did, in this case, a cookie as well. But there's another way you can use cookies that are non-HTTP only. So you don't necessarily need to use the session storage helper from Remix. You can use just a normal use cookies hook from like a package like React Cookie. And in this case, we have the similar power of the session storage, but we can set cookies on the client. So in our client React code, we can have this hook that is setting a theme. And so, for example, we call set cookie with the theme, and that will set it immediately. And then anytime we navigate around the website and we need to do a server render, Remix will see that cookie as well. And so the key here is not to use HTTP only. So we set HTTP only false, and then we make sure that we can access this from JavaScript and the hooks. On the Remix side, you can get this very simply. The universal cookie package is a way to just help parsing cookies. But even if you didn't have that, you can parse the headers yourself. In this case, it was very easy to use the cookies helper here. And you just get the cookie header, and then you have a bunch of cookies to parse. And in this case, you get the theme from that key. This was really, really helpful. And the fact that you can access these from the client makes it really powerful as well to make it so you can edit them in real time. All right, so session flash. This was a pattern that was pretty popular with server rendering, because you would have to store some state, and then when you redirect to a new page, you would want to show some message to the user. So it's a way to kind of return the result of the action. So we had a use case for this on the login page, or like reset password. So when you're resetting the password, we want to show a message, redirect you back to login and show a message. So in Remix, this is really easy. So you take your session that you get from the request, and then you just say session.flash with some key, can be anything, and then some object, the message that you want to send. So in our case, it's like a success message type, and then the message, your password has been changed. And then you redirect to the login URL, for instance, and say set cookie. And the session storage.commit session is how you do that with Remix to send that new cookie. And then in the loader on the login page, for instance, you can get the current session and then read that redirect message and display it to your user however you want. Another really interesting use case here was anonymous view tracking. And this is the exact same as all of the other session type storages. So you can use this same session storage for all of these, but I actually saw this with Kent C. Dodd's website, where he was storing the client ID of users so that he could store the read status of different blog posts as people navigate the site before they log in. And it turned out we had a very similar use case where we wanted to track views for different events. And anonymous view tracking is a pretty good way to do that. And so you just store a client ID. Multi-page form state is another great use case. You can store whatever you want in a cookie, or you can store some key to like Redis. But the multi-page form state is really pretty impressive, and we have implemented this as well. And it is really helpful to be able to just store like each page's form data as you go, and then when you get to the end, you have it all. And this is kind of very similar to what the original intent was. So going forward, I think cookies are here to stay, and the humble cookie will live on for sure. Remix has made it incredibly easy to use these in everyday development, and I can't really imagine not having them again. In fact, in order to facilitate our process from Meteor, we basically hacked the server rendering step in Meteor so that we could use cookies there as well, and that has made our lives so much easier. So long live the humble cookie. Thank you.